Good evening, everyone. Tonight we will step into a world where the hedgerows are prim, the village greens are emerald, and the whispers carry more weight than shouts. A world where the clatter of a teapot can hide the thud of a secret and the quietest heart may harbor the loudest desires. In the tranquil embrace of an English village, where time seems to slow, peculiar things have a way of unfolding. And it is in these serene settings that an unassuming figure, with eyes as sharp as a robin's and a mind as intricate as a spider's web, often finds herself untangling the most perplexing human knots. So settle into your favorite chair, perhaps, with a cup of tea, and prepare to be drawn into a tale where every shadow holds a clue and every smile a potential deception. Now, let's start with the first chapter of The Midnight Train to St. Mary Mead. Chapter 1. The Unexpected Arrival. St. Mary Mead, nestled in its green valley, usually slept soundly beneath the velvet cloak of the English night. The clatter of the 9:15 to Paddington was typically the last significant event before the village plunged into a deep, peaceful slumber, punctuated only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant bark of a farm dog. However, on a particularly crisp Tuesday evening in the spring of 1928, a subtle ripple disturbed this accustomed tranquility. Mrs. Carmichael, the village's newest resident, a woman of refined but somewhat distant demeanor, had recently taken up residence in the Laurels, a charming cottage on the outskirts, formerly belonging to the reclusive Miss Henderson. Her arrival had naturally stirred the gentle currents of village gossip, but even this minor excitement had begun to settle. It was, after all, simply a new face amongst the familiar tapestry. Tonight, however, the midnight train to St. Mary, Mead, usually a ghost of a service carrying little more than parcels, or the occasional late-returning commercial traveler, brought something quite out of the ordinary. Mr. Davies, the station-master, a man whose life revolved around timetables, and the punctual arrival of trains, was the first to notice. As the great steam beast hissed to a halt, casting long dancing shadows across the platform, a lone figure alighted. He was a gentleman of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed in a tweed suit, with a neatly trimmed mustache and keen, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the sleepy station with an almost unnerving intensity. He carried a single, well-worn leather valise. "Good evening," he had said, his voice surprisingly deep for such a late hour. "I believe this is St. Mary Mead?" Mr. Davies, accustomed to the quiet anonymity of his midnight duties, was a little flustered. "Indeed, sir, you're rather late for the last connection to anywhere, I'm afraid." The gentleman merely offered a thin smile. "No matter. I intend to stay here for a short while. A Mr. Armitage, at your service. Could you direct me to the local inn? I understand there is one. The 3 Crowns? That there is, sir. Straight down the lane, can't miss it." Mr. Davies, ever the conscientious public servant, offered to call a trap, but Mr. Armitage declined, insisting he preferred a walk afters. His journey. He seemed unusually secretive about his reasons for visiting, offering no more than a vague gesture about some quiet contemplation. As Mr. Armitage strode off into the moonlit lane, his figure quickly swallowed by the shadows, Mr. Davies felt a prickle of unease. There was something in the man's hurried departure, his almost evasive manner, that struck him as odd. St. Mary Mead rarely saw such nocturnal arrivals, and never one quite so self-contained. He watched until the last wisp of steam from the departing train vanished into the night sky, then turned to lock up. It was then, just beside the bench where the mysterious Mr. Armitage had briefly rested, that he saw it. A second valise, smaller than the first, but surprisingly heavy, forgotten and locked. It bore the initial A etched subtly into the leather. Mr. Davies, a stickler for order, hesitated. He knew Miss Marple, returning from an evening visit to the vicarage, often took the path past the station at this hour. He found himself almost hoping she would appear, and as if summoned by his thought, a familiar bird-like figure in a sensible tweed coat came into view, her kind eyes observing the world with an unblinking gaze. He approached her, the forgotten valise feeling remarkably significant in his grasp, an unspoken question hanging in the cool night air. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice edged with an unusual tremor, "there's been a most peculiar arrival." Chapter 2. A Gentleman. Gone astray. Miss Marple, with her customary gentle curiosity, listened intently to Mr. Davies's account, her expression calm, but her mind already cataloguing the details. The forgotten valise, rather ordinary in appearance, save for its surprising weight, and the single engraved A became a focal point. She noted the station master's unusual agitation, a man whose temperament was typically as steady as the railway tracks themselves. A gentleman traveling light, yet burdened by a second, forgotten bag, she mused, her knitting needles clicking softly as she walked the short distance home, the valise now carefully placed in her capable hands. The following morning, inquiries at the Three Crowns confirmed Mr. Davies's initial unease. Mr. Armitage had indeed made a reservation request, even specified a quiet room, but he had never arrived to check in. The innkeeper, Mr. Hemmings, a stout man with a booming laugh, was genuinely perplexed. Never had a gentleman just vanish like that. Said he was going to walk too. Rather a long stroll from the station to here at that hour. The news, as all news does in St. Mary Mead, spread like wildfire through the morning callers and over garden fences. Mrs. Lumley, ever the purveyor of village intelligence, speculated wildly over her morning coffee. "Run off with a lady, I expect, or perhaps a secret agent. You mark my words, there's more to this Armitage than meets the eye." Dr. Haydock, however, offered a more concrete, albeit unsettling, piece of information during his house calls. He mentioned seeing a figure matching Mr. Armitage's description walking briskly toward the old mill house, a dilapidated structure that had stood empty for years, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the overgrown grounds. The mill house was steeped in local legend, rumored to be haunted, and certainly not a place one would seek for a quiet night's rest. "I was returning from a late-night delivery up at Farmer Giles's," Dr. Haydock explained to Miss Marple, dabbing his brow with a handkerchief. "Must have been midnight. The moon was bright, and I saw a man, quite clearly, heading that way. Odd, I thought. Place is derelict." The quiet unease intensified. A local boy, young Timmy, who often ventured into the woods around the mill house to hunt for birds' nests, added another disquieting detail. He swore he had heard a faint, distressed cry like that of an injured animal emanating from the direction of the mill house sometime after midnight. His mother dismissing it as a nightmare, had paid him no mind, but the story now recirculated with a fresh, chilling emphasis. "Sounded like someone in trouble," Timmy insisted to anyone who would listen, his eyes wide with remembered fear. By late afternoon, with no sign of Mr. Armitage, and the forgotten valise still an enigma, the local constable, P.C. Troughton, a young man more accustomed to mediating boundary disputes than investigating disappearances, felt compelled to act. Under the gentle but persistent urging of Miss Marple, who subtly highlighted the confluence of odd details, a small search party was organized. Constable Troughton, Mr. Davies, Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple herself, cloaked in her sensible tweed, set off towards the mill house. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long, eerie shadows that stretched towards the ominous, silent building. As they approached, a chill wind rustled through the ancient trees. A faint metallic creak sounded, and they saw it. The heavy wooden door of the mill house, usually bolted shut, was ajar, swinging ever so slightly in the evening breeze, an unsettling invitation into the unknown. Chapter 3. The Discovery at the Mill. A collective gasp, quickly suppressed, escaped the small party as they pushed open the creaking door of the mill house. The interior was a symphony of dust and decay, moonlight filtering through grimy windows to illuminate dancing motes in the stagnant air, cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of their shoes on the gritty floor. They moved cautiously through the vast, empty ground floor, past the silent, hulking machinery of the old mill, their footsteps echoing unnervingly. It was Dr. Haydock who found him in a smaller antechamber that must once have served as an office or living quarter. Mr. Armitage was slumped over a heavy, dust-laden oak desk, his head resting awkwardly amidst a scattering of ancient yellowed papers. His tweed coat was still neatly buttoned. His hat lay on the floor beside an overturned chair, suggesting a sudden, unexpected collapse rather than a struggle. A half-empty glass of what appeared to be water stood beside his outstretched hand. His eyes, fixed in an unseeing stare, seemed to hold a final bewildered question. Dr. Haydock knelt quickly, a practiced hand reaching for a pulse that wasn't there. "He's gone," he pronounced, his voice hushed. "No obvious signs of injury. Appears peaceful, almost." Constable Troughton, pale but determined, immediately secured the scene, dispatching Mr. Davies to summon Inspector Slack from Much Benham and, with a glance at Miss Marple, suggesting she remain outside. But Miss Marple, ever observant, had already taken in more than just the immediate tragedy. She noted the overturned chair, suggesting a sudden movement. Her gaze lingered on a single wilted rose, its petals curling at the edges, lying incongruously on the dusty desk beside Armitage's still hand. And then a faint, almost imperceptible scent, something sweet and cloying, that clung to the air despite the overwhelming odor of decay, not quite of the old mill dust. Inspector Slack, a man of solid build and even more solid common sense, arrived with a team from Much Benham. His initial assessment concurred with Dr. Haydock's. No signs of struggle, no forced entry. "Looks like a heart attack, perhaps," he muttered, though his brow was furrowed with professional doubt. It was during the more thorough examination that a crucial detail emerged. As the body was gently moved, a small, intricately carved silver locket, seemingly new and remarkably unblemished by the dust of the mill, was found clutched tightly in Mr. Armitage's left hand. When prized open, it revealed a faded, sepia-toned photograph of a young woman, her face delicate and framed by elaborate waves of hair, her eyes holding a wistful, almost melancholic gaze. "Curious," Inspector Slack remarked, turning the locket over in his gloved hand. "Why would he be clutching this?" He declared the death suspicious, ordering the area cordoned off and the body removed for a full post-mortem. As the official investigation began to take its course, Miss Marple, standing quietly by the doorway, her gaze returning to the glass on the desk, noticed something the others had missed. A tiny, almost imperceptible scratch, like a faint score mark, on the inner rim of the glass, just below where the waterline would have been. A detail so subtle it might have been dismissed as a flaw in the glass, but to Miss Marple it was a discordant note in the otherwise silent room. Chapter 4. Whispers and Alibis. The news of Mr. Armitage's untimely demise at the mill house ripped through St. Mary Mead like a sudden gale, scattering the village's accustomed calm. The quiet murmurings about his mysterious arrival transformed into a cacophony of speculation, each theory more elaborate than the last. Mrs. Lumley, of course, was in her element. "Poison, I tell you," she declared to anyone who would listen, her eyes gleaming with morbid delight. That old mill house always had a bad reputation. Probably a ghost did it, or perhaps some secret society, with ancient rites. She then launched into a detailed, if wildly inaccurate, history of the mill house's previous owner, a reclusive artist named Alistair Finch, who had supposedly vanished into thin air years ago, leaving behind debts and a trail of broken hearts. Inspector Slack, a man who preferred facts to fanciful theories, methodically interviewed potential witnesses. Mr. Davies, the station master, recounted Mr. Armitage's evasive manner and the forgotten valise. Dr. Haydock reiterated his sighting of Armitage near the mill house. Young Timmy, emboldened by the tragedy, now vividly described the ghostly wailing he'd heard. Yet none of it provided a clear motive or a culprit. Miss Marple, meanwhile, moved through the village like a quiet observer, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. She listened, she knitted, and she watched. She noted the reactions to the unfolding drama, the eager self-importance of Mrs. Lumley, the genuine concern of the vicar, the guarded reticence of others. She paid particular attention to the residents, living closest to the mill house, especially the new resident, Mrs. Carmichael. Upon hearing the news, Mrs. Carmichael had expressed the appropriate degree of shock and regret. "Such a dreadful thing to happen in our quiet village," she'd murmured to Miss Marple, who had paid her a polite call. However, when Miss Marple gently inquired if she had heard anything unusual on the night of Mr. Armitage's arrival, Mrs. Carmichael's composure had wavered. "Heard anything? Oh, no, dear Miss Marple. I am a very sound sleeper, thank heavens. Not a whisper reaches me once my head hits the pillow." Her voice, though steady, was accompanied by a subtle tremor in her hands, noticeable as she refilled Miss Marple's teacup. She quickly changed the subject, turning the conversation to her meticulously tended rose garden. Miss Marple, a connoisseur of human behavior, filed away the detail. A sound sleeper, yet visibly flustered by a simple question. Days later, the Uisgiuhar official post-mortem report was released, confirming Mrs. Lumley's morbid prediction. Mr. Armitage had indeed been poisoned. The toxin was identified as a rare, fast-acting plant alkaloid, difficult to detect and even harder to source, suggesting a premeditated act rather than an opportunistic one. The locket found clutched in his hand was confirmed to be an antique of exquisite craftsmanship, certainly not a trinket. Inspector Slack now faced a full-blown murder case with a mysterious victim, a rare poison, and a village full of secrets. He publicly announced the cause of death, hoping it would shake loose more information. Privately, he admitted to Miss Marple that he was entirely baffled. "It's like a puzzle with half the pieces missing, Miss Marple," he confessed. Miss Marple merely nodded, her eyes twinkling with a knowing light. For her, the puzzle pieces were slowly but surely beginning to assemble, piece by unsettling piece. Chapter 5. The Woman in the Photograph. The confirmation of poisoning lent a grim, thrilling edge to the village's conversations. While Inspector Slack pursued conventional police inquiries, interviewing everyone who might have seen anything, Miss Marple, with her characteristic quiet persistence, turned her attention to the small silver locket. Its intricate carving and the style of the photograph within spoke volumes to her discerning eye. She recognized the sepia tones and specific studio artistry as characteristic of a particular London photographic establishment that had flourished some 4 decades prior. Armed with this subtle piece of knowledge and the locket itself, borrowed from the inspector with a promise of extreme care, Miss Marple discreetly began to show the faded image to a few of the older, more reliable villagers. Most simply shook, their heads unable to place the melancholic young woman. But then, during an afternoon tea at the Bantrys', a spark of recognition flickered in Mrs. Bantry's eyes. Dolly Bantry, usually quite voluble, became uncharacteristically quiet as she peered at the photograph through her spectacles. "My goodness," she breathed, a distant memory stirring. "That face. It reminds me of Eleanor Vance. Yes, it must be her, though a younger, more ethereal Eleanor than I remember." Eleanor Vance. The name hung in the air, weighted with the unspoken history of St. Mary Mead. Mrs. Bantry, prompted by Miss Marple's gentle questions, recounted the story of Eleanor Vance, a strikingly beautiful girl, much admired, who had left the village under a cloud of scandal many, many years ago. She had been engaged to a respectable local man, but then had abruptly run off with a charming but penniless artist Alistair Finch, who had briefly taken up residence in the old mill house. The scandal had rocked the village, and Eleanor's family, a prominent but rigid lot, had disowned her, never speaking her name again. She was believed to have simply vanished, perhaps to London, perhaps abroad, her fate unknown. Her artist lover had also disappeared around the same time. A tragic business, Mrs. Bantry sighed, stirring her tea. Poor Eleanor, so beautiful, but so headstrong. She then added, almost as an afterthought, she had a locket, a family heirloom, very similar to this one, a twin almost. Her mother had given it to her before everything. This detail sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine, a shiver not of cold, but of dawning comprehension. The locket found clutched in Mr. Armitage's hand was a replica, or a very similar item. It was not, as Mrs. Bantry had subtly indicated, the original family heirloom. This was a crucial distinction, a subtle thread that, once pulled, promised to unravel a larger design. Why would Mr. Armitage carry a locket showing a woman identified as Eleanor Vance, and one that was not the original family piece? It suggested a deliberate message, a subtle misdirection, or perhaps a carefully orchestrated link to the past. The plot, Miss Marple realized, was thickening, not only with the current death, but with layers of long-buried village history. Chapter 6. Unraveling the Past. The identity of the woman in the locket, as Eleanor Vance, sparked a flurry of quiet contemplation in Miss Marple's mind. The threads began to weave themselves together. Eleanor Vance, the mill house, the artist Alistair Finch, and now the murdered Mr. Armitage. The connection was undeniable, a dark undercurrent flowing beneath the placid surface of St. Mary Mead's history. Miss Marple delved deeper, discreetly asking about Alistair Finch. She learned that it was indeed Finch who had owned the mill house, using it as his studio. His disappearance, following Eleanor Vance's, had been equally abrupt, leaving behind unfinished canvases and a number of unpaid bills. Some villagers had hinted at a scandal even greater than Eleanor's elopement, perhaps financial impropriety or a darker secret associated with the artist. Recalling Mrs. Bantry's mention of the original family heirloom locket, Miss Marple visited Mr. Potter, the local antique dealer and pawnbroker, a man with a prodigious memory for local treasures and their owners. After a polite but persistent conversation, Mr. Potter, polishing his spectacles, recalled a transaction from some months ago. Ah, yes, a silver locket, very distinctive, finely worked. A lady, a rather private lady, purchased it, paid in cash, quite particular about discretion. His description of the lady was vague. Respectable, well-dressed, but new to the area, I believe. He couldn't be more specific, as she had worn a veil and preferred to conduct her business swiftly. However, a flicker of recognition passed through Miss Marple's mind. The description, though vague, bore a striking resemblance to Mrs. Carmichael, the new resident of the Laurels, and an otherwise entirely unremarkable newcomer. Mrs. Carmichael, who had arrived suddenly, kept to herself, and seemed rather reticent about her own past. The coincidence felt too potent to be ignored. Mrs. Carmichael's nervous reaction when asked about the night of Armitage's death, coupled with her proximity to the mill house, began to nag at Miss Marple. Why would the new resident of St. Mary, Mead, purchase an ancient, distinctively significant locket, an heirloom once owned by Eleanor Vance? Was it mere chance, an appreciation for antiquities, or was it something far more deliberate? The timing, a few months prior to Mr. Armitage's arrival and subsequent death, felt too convenient. As Miss Marple walked home, the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with an unnerving precision. Mrs. Carmichael's new cottage, the Laurels, was not far from the mill house. The mill house, the site of the murder, had been Alistair Finch's studio, the man with whom Eleanor Vance had eloped. And now the second locket, a replica or a message, found on the body of a man who was clearly connected to Eleanor Vance. Curiouser and curiouser, Miss Marple murmured to herself, quoting from a favorite story. The elegant facade of Mrs. Carmichael's new life seemed to conceal a deeper, more intricate reality. She decided then and there that a social call to the Laurels was in order, not just for village pleasantries, but for a more pointed observation. Her intuition, a delicate but powerful instrument, was humming with a quiet urgency. Chapter 7. A Visit to Mrs. Carmichael. The following afternoon, Miss Marple, dressed in her most innocuous flowered hat and carrying a small posy of her own garden roses, paid her planned social call to Mrs. Carmichael. The Laurels was, as expected, immaculate. The garden was a symphony of perfectly pruned shrubs and carefully chosen blooms, almost clinically precise in its beauty, lacking the slightly wild, organic charm of an established English cottage garden. Inside, the house was equally pristine, polished surfaces, tasteful but impersonal furnishings, and an almost antiseptic air, as if no one truly lived there. Mrs. Carmichael greeted Miss Marple with polite warmth, offering tea and biscuits. She was elegantly dressed, her silver hair impeccably styled. Her hands, Miss Marple noted, still seemed to possess a faint, almost imperceptible tremor when they were at rest. The conversation drifted, as it often did, to local events and the tragic death at the Mill House. "Such a shocking affair, Miss Marple." Mrs. Carmichael sighed, her gaze drifting towards the window. "One simply doesn't expect such things in a place like St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple, while agreeing, gently steered the conversation towards the past, towards art, and towards local history. She spoke of the Mill House's reputation, of its former owner, Alistair Finch, the artist. Mrs. Carmichael, despite her claims of being new to the area, displayed a surprising, almost detailed knowledge of local gossip from decades past, correcting Miss Marple on a minor detail about the Finch family's land holdings. "Oh, I read a great deal, you see," she explained, almost too quickly. "Local histories, I find them quite fascinating. One learns so much about the social fabric." As the conversation continued, Miss Marple's senses, ever keen, picked up on something else, a faint, unique scent in Mrs. Carmichael's sitting room. It was not a modern perfume, but something richer, heavier, an old-fashioned floral note that seemed familiar, yet she couldn't quite place it. Then a memory surfaced, the same subtle, sweet, cloying scent she had detected at the Mill House, near Mr. Armitage's body, almost overwhelmed by the dust and decay, but distinct enough to have registered in her subconscious. It was like a ghost of a fragrance, a whisper from another time. Could it be Mrs. Carmichael's perfume, or something else entirely? As Miss Marple rose to leave, expressing her thanks for the tea, she casually glanced around the room one last time. It was then that she saw it. As Mrs. Carmichael moved to open the door, her sleeve had momentarily shifted, revealing her hand as it quickly, almost instinctively, pushed a small, glinting silver object into a drawer in a nearby side table. It was done with such practiced swiftness, such an immediate, almost unconscious desire to conceal, that it seemed to Miss Marple like a magician's trick, designed to be unseen. Yet Miss Marple, with her sharp eyes, had seen it. A flash of polished silver, exactly the size and shape of a locket. The pieces of the puzzle were not just clicking, they were locking into place with a chilling finality. Chapter 8. The Missing Artist and a Motive. The small silver flash in Mrs. Carmichael's drawer, combined with the distinctive, familiar scent, resonated deeply within Miss Marple. It was no longer a vague suspicion. A compelling narrative was forming in her mind, linking Mr. Armitage, Eleanor Vance, the Mill House, and now, almost certainly, Mrs. Carmichael. The past was not merely whispering, it was shouting. She returned to her meticulously organized files on St. Mary Mead's history, a personal archive of births, deaths, marriages, and scandals. Focusing on the Vance family, she discovered something significant in the old church. Records, Eleanor Vance had indeed had a younger brother, a boy named Arthur. He had been sent away to boarding school and, following Eleanor's scandal, had left St. Mary Mead entirely, never to return. His full name? Arthur Armitage. The pieces snapped together with a startling clarity. Mr. Armitage, the victim, was Eleanor Vance's brother. He had returned to St. Mary Mead after all these years, perhaps to reclaim his family's lost honor, perhaps to find answers about his sister, or perhaps most likely to confront Alistair Finch, the man who had brought ruin upon their family. This explained his secretive arrival, his desire for quiet contemplation. He was investigating, seeking out a past that had been deliberately buried. But why the mill house? And why was his sister's locket, or a replica, found on him? And if Eleanor Vance had left, where was she now? Miss Marple then recalled a conversation with Colonel Bantry from years ago concerning the old mill house and Alistair Finch. Colonel Bantry had mentioned, in passing, that Finch had been involved in a bitter dispute with Eleanor's family just before his disappearance. It wasn't just about Eleanor. It involved a substantial sum of money, or perhaps a significant piece of property, that had seemingly vanished with Finch. The mill house itself was part of the Vance family estate originally purchased by Finch years ago, but there had been a legal tangle over its ownership unresolved when everyone vanished. Suddenly, the motive began to emerge from the mists of time. If Arthur Armitage was returning to investigate his sister's disappearance and reclaim his family's property, or lost fortune, he would have started with the mill house, the last known location of Alistair Finch, and a place deeply entwined with his family's history. He was likely seeking something specific, a hidden will, a deed, or a clue to a hidden fortune related to the mill house. And someone did not want him to find it. The subtle scratch on the glass, the rare poison, the replica locket, the distinct perfume, and the concealed original locket all pointed to a carefully constructed deception, a cover-up designed to protect a carefully built new identity, and a long-held secret. The midnight train had brought more than just a stranger to St. Mary Mead. It had brought a past that was determined to be unearthed and a living secret that was determined to keep it buried. Miss Marple's quiet, knowing smile was grim. She knew with absolute certainty who had the most to lose from Mr. Armitage's reappearance and who had the motive to silence him permanently. Chapter 9. The Truth Unveiled. With the pieces of the puzzle firmly in place, Miss Marple felt a quiet but profound sense of certainty. The pattern of human behavior, so familiar to her, had emerged from the intricate tapestry of St. Mary Mead's, past and present. The midnight train, Mr. Armitage's arrival, the mill house, Eleanor Vance, and Mrs. Carmichael, all were interconnected by a chilling thread of deceit and desperation. The scratch on the glass, so minute yet so telling, had pointed to a specific method of poisoning. It wasn't a powdered poison stirred in. It was a liquid, likely introduced via a tiny hypodermic or dropper just below the surface of the water, a method leaving a faint score mark on the inner rim. The rare toxin Dr. Haydock identified was, Miss Marple realized, almost certainly a plant-based poison, readily available to someone with a meticulous garden. Her mind immediately flew to Mrs. Carmichael's pristine, almost clinical rose garden, where she had also noted a patch of monkshood, Aconitum napellus, a plant of exquisite beauty but deadly toxicity, and the scent, that old-fashioned, distinctive perfume. Miss Marple had finally placed it. Old Mrs. Finch, Alistair Finch's elderly mother, who had lived in the village until her passing, had always worn a particular imported violet perfume, a scent Eleanor Vance had adopted during her time at the mill house, mentioned by a now frail acquaintance of Miss Marple. It was a signature, a ghost of identity, subtly clinging to Mrs. Carmichael and to the heir of the mill house. It was time for the gentle confrontation. Miss Marple with the locket, the original family heirloom, now subtly secured in her reticule, walked to the Laurels one last time. Mrs. Carmichael, looking composed but with a subtle tension around her eyes, invited her in. Miss Marple began not with accusation, but with a narrative, a gentle unfolding of events. It's a tragic thing, Mrs. Carmichael, when the past refuses to stay buried. Mr. Armitage, poor man, was searching for answers, wasn't he? He was Arthur Armitage, Eleanor Vance's younger brother. Mrs. Carmichael's composure cracked, a barely perceptible flicker of fear in her eyes. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple." "Oh, but I think you do, Eleanor," Miss Marple continued softly, her voice still kind, yet unwavering. "You see, when you returned to St. Mary Mead, under a new name, you were perhaps seeking a fresh start, or perhaps even something you believed was rightfully yours from the past. And then Mr. Armitage arrived, tracking down his sister, seeking out the mill house where Alistair Finch had last been seen, and where a family fortune or property dispute lay dormant. He threatened your carefully constructed new life, didn't he? He threatened to expose who you truly are, Eleanor Vance." Miss Marple then took out the locket, the antique heirloom, placing it gently on the polished table. "And this, dear Eleanor, confirms it. The locket your mother gave you, the one you purchased from Mr. Potter months ago, the one you instinctively hid when I visited. You have kept it all these years, a testament to your true identity." Eleanor, Mrs. Carmichael, stared at the locket, then at Miss Marple. A tremor ran through her, and her perfectly maintained facade crumbled. "He would have ruined everything," she whispered, her voice choked. "He was going to expose me, take away my peace, claim the mill house and what was in it, what was rightfully mine." Her eyes, once so guarded, now held a desperate, haunted look. "I sent him to the mill house, told him Alistair had hidden papers there. I only wanted to talk, to reason with him. But he was so adamant, so righteous. I put it in his drink, the monk's hood from my own garden. It was so quick, so painless. I just wanted him to leave me alone." Her confession hung in the air, a chilling echo in the pristine room. The ghost of Eleanor Vance and the desperate woman she had become finally stood exposed. Chapter 10. The Reckoning and Farewell. Miss Marple left the Laurels a short while later, the confession of Eleanor Vance, née Mrs. Carmichael, echoing in her ears. The truth, as it often was a blend of long-held secrets, desperate ambition, and the tragic fear of exposure. Eleanor Vance, having perhaps come into an inheritance of her own from another branch of the family, had returned to St. Mary Mead years later, not just for a new life, but to claim the mill house and its hidden legacy, which Alistair Finch had promised her but never delivered before his own, now presumed, quiet disappearance. Arthur Armitage, her brother, had indeed come looking for answers, and perhaps a share of that legacy, threatening to undo Eleanor's carefully constructed world. Miss Marple relayed her findings to Inspector Slack with her usual calm precision, presenting the logical sequence of events, the subtle clues, and the compelling motive. The discovery of the original locket, Eleanor's confession, and the scientific confirmation of the monk's hood poison from her garden provided an unassailable case. Eleanor Vance, Mrs. Carmichael, was arrested quietly later that evening, her composure regained, but her eyes holding a deep, profound sadness. The village, upon learning the full story, was rocked to its core. The quiet new resident was, in fact, a figure from its scandalous past, a woman who had murdered her own brother to protect a new identity and a long-buried secret. The whispers in St. Mary Mead would now be laced with a darker, more dramatic intensity for years to come. As the commotion subsided and the quiet rhythm of St. Mary Mead began to reassert itself,